let's see if I can give continuity to this wonderful conversation. I think that any human being who has been the victim of repression knows what repression is. But sometimes they go further than just a little surveillance. They go further than going to the person's home. They go further than to talk to the family members of the person that they're after, or the persons that they are after. From the moment that the United States government arrived in Puerto Rico in 1898, invaded and occupied Puerto Rico militarily, from that moment on, there has not been a single decade without Puerto Ricans, political prisoners in this country, in the federal prisons of the United States. But everything started in Puerto Rico with the arrest of two individuals, both of them independentistas, both of them with small printing presses, and both of those men, just for the simple reason of being supporters of independence, were sent to prison. Both were sentenced to hard labor, and one of them, soon after he came home from prison, passed away. So from that moment on, Puerto Ricans have been constantly being repressed and have been the victims of two ways of repressing people. One is incarceration, the other one is assassination. And I think that we need to know those things and some of the history and some of the people, some of the names behind, some of the people who got killed and some of the ones who were responsible for the killings. It is probably the decade of the 30s when we begin to see this real vicious, very intolerant way of governing and trying to control Puerto Rico and attack the Puerto Rican independence movement. The Nationalist Party had become a fairly strong political party. In 1934, and this is probably what made the U.S. government react immediately, was that Don Pedro Albizu Campos led the sugarcane workers in a strike, and for the first time, 125,000 Puerto Rican sugarcane workers won a strike. Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos led the strike, and for the first time, there's a Puerto Rican movement, workers' movement that wins a victory. What happens after this is that they bring a very vicious military person to run the Puerto Rican Police Department. And Francis Elisha Riggs takes over, and he begins to move to do the things that show how repression really works. And in 1935, there's the first massacre in Puerto Rico called the Rio Piedra Massacre. 5 Puerto Ricans were killed. But it is interesting, they have been following these Puerto Ricans all along. they were in a car. And when they arrived in Rio Piedra, the police was waiting already with an ambush. And as soon as the police came out, they started killing the persons who were in the car. First person who comes out of the car is Ramon Pagan, and he gets killed. The second person that gets killed is Pedro Quiñones. The third person that gets killed is Eduardo Vega. The fourth person that gets killed is Jose M. Jimenez. The next person who did not get killed is Dionisio Pearson, but he got shot. During this fight, one policeman gets killed. Now, why would the police go that far? Why go and ambush people in a car? They were not engaged in any kind of criminal activity. But yet the police had license, Briggs had license, Briggs had given them license to kill. And another method of repression that is introduced the same year, 1935, is something that is real interesting. They asked Juan Antonio Corregel to turn all the papers that he had, because he was the Secretary General of the Nationalist Party, turn all the documents that he had to the federal government. And he refused, and he is sent to prison for contempt of court. So he is sent to prison for refusing to do something that he was not going to do, they had no right to ask him for any of that stuff, and he had every right to refuse to turn those papers over to the government. So he's in prison. The next move that they make is that they're going to incarcerate as many leaders of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. And the professor Yvonne Acosta talked about the whole thing of speeches, people being criminalized for speech making. One of the crimes that they charged Albizu with was the speeches that he had made right after the massacre, during the massacre, when people were being buried, when the religious services were being performed. He made speeches, and those speeches were criminalized. Albizu and 7 other members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party are sentenced in court. But it was interesting how this is done. The first trial, after all the procedures in court, was a hung jury, and there was not satisfaction. There was not a satisfactory result that they wanted. Especially Cecil Snyder, who was the prosecutor, and the judge. So all of a sudden, they decide to do something different, to get a jury that they handpicked for the second trial. And of course, in the second trial, all 8 of them get convicted to 10 years in prison. All of them ended up in Atlanta Penitentiary. And that was not enough. That was not enough. In 1937, the following year, on Palm Sunday, in the town of Ponce, The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party had asked to be able to march, to do a performance. They had been granted permission to do it, but the governor, the man who was governor in Puerto Rico at that time, decided to cancel the permit, but without really informing the nationalists. And then when the police came and informed the nationalists refused because they thought that they had the right to the march to do what they were going to do. And again, the police had an ambush. They had created an ambush. And as soon as the nationalists, these are members of the Nationalist Party, none of them were armed. There was not a single person who was armed. And as soon as they started walking, the police opened fire on them. At the end of the shootout, there were 22 Puerto Ricans who had been killed and over 200 of them wounded. Now, if we were to ask people in this country if that massacre ever happened, if there was such a thing, very few people in this country would know that such a massacre took place in Puerto Rico. And again, we can see repression. We can see how people are being repressed. And it is very interesting because whenever there was a massacre, whenever anything like that happened, they would use the event to inculcate fear in the person's mind. It's a way of sending this chilling effect into those who were already committed to independence. It was a way of neutralizing, of scaring people away from the movement, take them away from the movement. It doesn't end there. In 1947, finally, 1943, the United States government decides to release the nationalists who were in prison. But Don Pedro Albizu Campos was not allowed to return to Puerto Rico. So it's not until 1947 when he's allowed to go to Puerto Rico. And by the way, the only reason that in 1943 they were released from prison was because the United States government was asking Latin American countries to get involved to support the U.S. in World War II. And some of the presidents of those countries took a position asking that if the United States government will release the nationalists, especially Don Pedro Albizu Campos, that they were willing to help and support World War II. So that was the only reason they were released. Otherwise, they would have been in prison until 1947. And it is in 1947 when Don Pedro Albizu Campos is allowed to return to Puerto Rico. As soon as Don Pedro Albizu Campos arrives, the campaign, the hatred campaign, which Professor Acosta talked about, starts taking place. All this way of creating laws that can criminalize people is a new one. You know, creating a way of criminalizing people. But imagine a Puerto Rico with a flag being that a crime. Or a Puerto Rican talking about Puerto Rican independence being that a crime. People being criminalized for such things. And the effects that criminalizing people have on people. Because it's always a chilling effect behind it. And as soon as Don Pedro Albizu Campos started making his speeches, going around trying to reorganize the Nationalist Party, the repression started. And everywhere he went, he would be followed. There was always policemen following him. And Don Pedro, once in a while, would go directly to the policeman car and tell him, hey, listen, you don't have to worry, just follow me. So to let him know that he knew that they were following him. In 1950, the 30th of October, Don Pedro Albizu Campos decided to call for the revolt of Jayuya. But this is as a reaction to the decision of the governor of Puerto Rico and what the governor of Puerto Rico was trying to do and what the federal government was trying to do in Puerto Rico. And the federal government and the governor of Puerto Rico and the police and everybody knew that the 30th of October there was going to be an uprising in Puerto Rico. So they were prepared. They had everything ready for the event. And as soon as people start mobilizing, the repression begins. And in Jayuya, where the movement really for that day begins, the revolt starts with people taking up arms. This is an armed uprising. This is the time when the uprising was planned and people were willing to give their lives for the independence of Puerto Rico. So throughout Puerto Rico, people rose up in arms. In Jayuya, in Utuado, Arecibo, in San Juan. They went even to Fortaleza. They went to where the governor was supposed to be. And practically everywhere, mostly everybody either got wounded or got killed, or those who were able to get away were soon arrested. The town of Jayuya was bombed. The town of Utuado was bombed because they used the Puerto Rican National Guard, which is a branch of the U.S. Army. So this is the way that it was dealt with. But the governor of Puerto Rico and the federal government, they could have stopped the whole thing. They didn't have to go that far. They didn't have to. They knew what was going to happen. They could have arrested them before without any shooting, without any killings. And if we want to see repression, and if we want to see justice, and if we want to see what law really is, we can look at the sentences that the people who got arrested received after the revolt. There is a family from Arecibo, they're the Diaz family. And it's the father and two sons. The mother gets arrested. And the charge against her is giving food and shelter to her husband and her two sons. She got sentenced to 440 years in prison for that. And mostly everyone who was sentenced, and some of the people had nothing to do with the uprising, but they got arrested. Some of them, we got 100 years for hardly nothing. I have an uncle who got arrested, and he was kept for 5 days. But the effects of my uncle's arrest scared so much the whole family. I was 7 years old then, and we panicked. We thought that they were coming for us, and my parents were telling us not to mention anything about our uncle to anyone, not to say anything, mention any of the nationalists if we heard anything or read anything on the news about them. So the chilling effect works because I experienced it as a child, 7 years old, and we were real scared. I mean, we wouldn't even come out of the house. So this is the reality of what repression really does to a people. This is how the United States government has always treated Puerto Rico. But then there was not enough. In 1960, J. Edgar Hoover sends a memo to the agent in charge in San Juan. And in that memo, he asked the agent not to concern himself with the ideology of all the leaders of the independence movement, those that they had identified, or those who they were already going after, but to delve deep into their personal lives. And the message was that nationalism, Puerto Rican nationalism, had to be eradicated by all means. And during the decade of the 60s is when we really see this new move towards destroying the Puerto Rican national spirit. Puerto Ricans, stop Puerto Ricans from being Puerto Ricans. And that's what repression really is. And they definitely started, the FBI started this real ugly campaign against Puerto Rican independentistas. The campaign went as far as to take pictures of one leader and another leader and the wife of one of them, and put them together and say, you send a letter to the wife and say your husband has been having an affair with a woman of so and so, and the husband whose wife was on the picture will get a letter to telling him that his wife was cheating on him. That was a way to divide the leadership of the Nationalist Party or the independence movement, because by that time it was a fairly large independence movement, not only the Puerto Rican Nationalists, but there are other organizations. They went as far as to start destroying the places where the independentistas had, for example, the printing presses that Claridad used to use. Claridad was the newspaper of the Movimiento Pro Independencia, MPI. They were destroying things, but at the same time, they were doing things that definitely were even more detrimental. They were having all these informers placed in different organizations, and they were moving, and creating all kinds of false charges for the socialist league that was led by Don Juan Antonio Corregel, they came up with a case where they were facing up to 400 years in prison with the charges that they were being hit with. Finally, they realized when they went to court that that the informant was a liar, and the judge decided to throw the case out of court. So we can come to the 60s in Chicago, because this is important. In 1968, the Young Lords founded it was a kind of street group or street gang, whatever they want to call it. But in 1968, they took over a church, and it became a political organization. And as soon as that happened, the persecution began. And there was not a single moment where there was not persecution against the Young Lords. Once they started. It was started by a young Puerto Rican, very charismatic, with a good sense of humor. A guy that just came from the streets, but could bring his all these young people around him and bring them together. And he would make some excellent speeches, and he started attacking all the police brutality that was taking place, and they were trying to also, the area was being gentrified, so they were talking about, making sure that the Puerto Rican community will not be displaced, but they were being displaced. They were also doing programs in the church. One day, the minister of that church gets killed, and they try to bring the charges of accuse the Young Lords of killing the minister. And by the way, according to, and this has never come out, but there was a Cuban group already operating in Chicago, just like they were operating in Puerto Rico. And these are anti-Castro Cubans, and they were not satisfied with the conditions in the church, what was happening in the church. And most likely they think that the pastor was killed by the Cubans, just like a young Cuban in 1979 in Puerto Rico who has started a traveling agency in Puerto Rico to make it possible for Puerto Ricans or Cubans in Puerto Rico to go to Cuba to travel back and forth. In 1979, he gets assassinated by a group of Cubans who were organized. He was part of Alpha 66, Alpha 66, or Coro. There were several reactionary but very, very dangerous organizations that were created by the Cubans. And he got killed. To this day, one of the men went on the radio one day and said he was a Cuban guy, and he said that he had killed the guy, but nothing ever happened. He's still Julio Labatut, who said that, still walking around Puerto Rico, as a free man. So basically, I'm trying to do this in a way that is probably just to show repression and how far repression goes, how much we have endured, and I can go on for quite a bit of more, because a lot of the killings I have not been able to cover, but this continue within the Puerto Rican Police Department. They created an intelligence division, and they created there a death squad. And the death squad carried out quite a few killings. So this is more complicated, and it takes much longer than the time that we have. So I'm going to stop right here. But this is the idea of killing people, the idea of sending people to prison, the idea of criminalizing people for making a speech or waving a flag. Those are the things that many people do not understand. we have endured, Puerto Ricans have endured all kinds of repressions, all kinds of repressions. We have spent time in prison, but we have been killed. We have been forced into exile. We have been thrown out of Puerto Rico. We've been forced to emigrate out of Puerto Rico as soon as the United States government got into Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans ended up in Hawaii. They ended up in the southwest part of the United States. So the kind of repression and the kind of movement that has been used against us is very, very criminal. It's very, very dehumanizing. It's everything that should not be done in this world. And if we want a better, a more just world, we have to transcend all the hatred. We cannot justify things by lying. We cannot justify killings by falsifying records, by doing things to people who just want two things, freedom and justice. And that's what Puerto Ricans basically want in this world. We want a free Puerto Rico, we want an independent Puerto Rico. We're not people who are really fomenting hatred and fear either, by the way. We have attempted at each state of our struggle to be very, very careful, to be people who show the love that we have for our homeland, to be the same love that we show for everybody else. So I thank you, and I hope that you will just hope you have a good conversation. Thank you.
I hate to cut anybody off because there's